Shalom. I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to be sharing with you regarding the current status of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and it is as follows. In a recent speech, U.S. President Barack Obama called on Israel and the Palestinians to accept a framework agreement which he said could be achieved within months without covering the full details of the dispute between Israel and the Palestinians. The framework agreement would omit the Gaza Strip and provide for a transition period before an agreed-upon final settlement between the two parties. Israeli TV reports that the United States wants Israel and the Palestinians to agree to a framework agreement by the end of January. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry expanded on Obama's statement by saying that a basic framework will address all the core issues, namely borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, mutual recognition, and an end of all claims. And it will have to establish agreed guidelines for subsequent negotiations which will spell out the details of a full-fledged peace treaty. Obama said that there was not a lot of secrets and surprises during these rounds of direct peace talks, and that we know that what the outline of a potential final agreement is. And then the question becomes, are both sides willing to take the very tough political risks involved if their bottom lines are met? And he defined the Palestinian bottom line as a real and meaningful state and Israel's bottom line as a secure Jewish state. Obama also stated that a final and comprehensive peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians must be reached within 6 months after a framework agreement in order to make it impossible for Iran to attain a nuclear bomb. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said that the United States is not seeking an interim peace agreement. He said, "It is essential, in my judgment, to reach for a full agreement and to have a framework within which we can try to work for that." The U.S. State Department said, "Just to be absolutely clear, we are not focused on an interim peace agreement. We are focused on a final status deal." That is what both sides are discussing, and both sides remain committed to, and there should not be any confusion about what a framework reference is. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry wants Israel and the Palestinians to agree to a framework peace agreement that will include all the main issues, including security, the future of Jerusalem, and the fate of refugees, which will serve as a broad outline for the final peace agreement. In order to agree on the details of the framework agreement, direct peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians would need to extend beyond April. The U.S. framework proposal would focus on bridging gaps between Israel and the Palestinians on the core issues of the conflict and would be an arbitration plan which the United States believes would be an acceptable compromise to both sides. Other U.S. officials say that the United States is not dictating the terms, but rather trying to get both sides to agree on what those terms should be. In an effort to reach a goal of a framework agreement between Israel and the Palestinians by the end of January, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry discussed a plan to deploy a regional international peace force which would include U.S. troops along Israel's Jordan Valley. It is part of a U.S. plan to combat the influence of al-Qaeda in the region. This regional force would secure parts of Syria, as well as Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the future Palestinian state, and Israel against al-Qaeda attack from positions in Syria, Iraq, and the Egyptian Sinai. Kerry proposed integrating Israeli and Palestinian Special Force units in the planned regional counter-terror force alongside the American, British, French, Saudi, Jordanian, Egyptian, and Qatari units enlisted to the new framework. Kerry added that the U.S. security plan he presented was the most thorough analysis ever of the Israeli requirements that arise from the potential of a two-state solution, and that the United States was working with Jordan and the Palestinians to create a layered approach that both guarantees Israel's security and fully respects Palestinian sovereignty. In the U.S. plan, Israel would keep a military presence in the Jordan Valley for a period of 10 years. Kerry said that U.S. General John Allen, along with 160 U.S. experts, worked on the details details of the plan. Much time has been spent by a U.S. security team to understand from an Israeli perspective what is required for the security of Israel in a two-state scenario. Kerry added, if Israel's security cannot be increased through this agreement, it would be very difficult for Israel to agree to a framework agreement with the Palestinians. So we are making certain that we are addressing each and every one of Israel's security concerns. We understand that we can't dictate to Israel what its needs for its security are, but what we have done is to try to understand these needs and see through a consultative process if there are ways through technology and additional ideas that we could potentially provide for, Kerry said. The U.S. plan would allow Israel soldiers performing security functions in the West Bank and the Jordan Valley. Jordan has been pushing the United States to support Israel's position that it needs to maintain a security presence in the Jordan Valley under any agreement with the Palestinians. Other key elements of the U.S. security plan provides for a series of border crossings along the Jordan Valley border between the West Bank and Jordan, which would be jointly controlled by Israel and the Palestinians. The entire border itself, however, would remain under full Israeli control, with the Israeli military joined only by a symbolic Palestinian security presence. These arrangements would hold for many years, but not necessarily permanently. Furthermore, the U.S. would provide an additional security envelope which would utilize drones and other high-tech equipment to provide real-time intelligence on any terrorist threats and other unlawful border activity. In addition to this, Kerry said the Palestinian refugee situation must be resolved. A Palestinian state must be established, and recognition of Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people must be achieved. The Palestinians rejected the U.S. plan, claiming it would allow Israelis to continue to live in the region and that Kerry's security proposals were very bad ideas which the Palestinians could not accept. Yasser Abed Rabo, a senior official of the Palestinians, said that the U.S. proposal for Israel's security would lead to the total failure of peace talks. Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that Israel's security must remain entirely in Israel's hands. As a result, Israeli sources say that the security plan is interesting and complex, but ultimately not sufficient. Naftali Bennett, the leader of the conservative political party Jewish Home, said the following: recently, we've been hearing a new tone, an international guarantee that will safeguard Israel's security. Bennett stated, we are told that they found the answer to all of our security problems. We can evacuate the West Bank and the Jordan Valley. We can place cameras, lasers, helicopters, and especially rely on international forces and the security guarantees of our friends. In 2006, at the end of the Second Lebanon War, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1701, which prohibits the entry of all weapons into southern Lebanon. The end result, however, was that Hezbollah has since smuggled in over 100,000 missiles into southern Lebanon. In 2006, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1696 that determined that Iran must stop all enrichment and may not build any additional centrifuges. Result was that Iran has increased the amount of its centrifuges from only 164 to 18,500. Over a year ago, the President of the United States determined that if Syria used chemical weapons against its people, that this would be crossing a red line which would lead to military action. However, Syria has killed hundreds of residents with chemical weapons, and military action did not happen from the United States. This has happened dozens of times around the world. Guarantees are words, they are not actions, he said. We will continue to defend ourselves by ourselves. It has worked well for Israel over the last 65 years. Following the security plan, the United States plans in the next several weeks to reveal its views on the other core issues of the conflict, namely Jerusalem, the borders of a Palestinian state, and Palestinian refugees. Following the Palestinians' stubborn refusal to accept the U.S. plan for security arrangements in the Jordan Valley, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry announced the third phase of releasing Palestinian prisoners from Israeli prisons, which is planned to take place on December the 29th, could be delayed by Israel
for 1 month. The intended purpose would be to put pressure on Mahmoud Abbas to be more flexible in accepting the U.S. proposed plan for Israeli security in the Jordan Valley. Before the current round of direct peace talks began in the summer, Israel agreed to release 104 Palestinian terrorists from its prisons as a gesture to Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas. 52 terrorists have already been released, and the rest are to be released in 2 more phases. Yasser Abed Rabo, an aide to Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, accused the United States of using the Palestinian prisoners to blackmail the Palestinians to accept a framework agreement that fails to meet Palestinian demands. 2 Palestinian officials said Kerry proposed to free all remaining prisoners in late January and linked the release to the U.S. and Israel accepting a framework peace agreement. Kerry offered the Palestinians that the 4th group of prisoners will be released sooner so that the remaining Palestinian prisoners could be released at the end of January. Kerry had wanted the prisoner release to take place at the same time as the presentation of a potential U.S. framework agreement in the coming weeks. After the Palestinians refused to accept the U.S. request to delay the release of Palestinian prisoners, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said that the prisoner release will take place on December the 29th as scheduled. Nabil Sha'ath, a senior official within the Palestinians, said that the Palestinians will remain in talks with Israel for the full 9 months to ensure that all Palestinian prisoners are released. He added that if it were not for the release of the 104 prisoners, the Palestinians would have quit the peace talks already. If peace talks fail, the Palestinians say that they are ready to appeal to join more international organizations, including the International Criminal Court. Sha'ath repeated that he desires that the Palestinians petition all of the UN organizations, not only for the Palestinian terrorists to be released, but also to push Israel back to the 1967 borders. The declaration of the Palestinian Authority as a UN non-member observer state recognizes the Palestinians as having borders on the 1967 lines, he said. This gives us the right to be full members of other international organizations, including the International Criminal Court. Meanwhile, Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas rejected recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. Furthermore, the Palestinians said that there would be no deal with Israel that excludes the Palestinians controlling the Jordan Valley. Also, East Jerusalem must be the capital of a Palestinian state. In addition, the Palestinians also expressed opposition to the presence of any settlement blocks in the West Bank in the context of a future deal with Israel. We can't accept that the airspace, borders, and border crossings remain under the control of Israel, the Palestinians said. Finally, Abbas said that he would never give up an ounce of the Palestinians' demands nor sign a peace agreement that failed to meet the national aspirations of the Palestinian people, including a full Israeli withdrawal from all the lands liberated in 1967, establishment of East Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state, and a full return to their original homes, the families that fled Israel when it was established in 1948. In a recent visit to Israel by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, Israel experienced a major snowstorm. In justifying his claim that the Palestinians must not recognize Israel as a Jewish state, Mahmoud Abbas supported his demand by blaming Jews in Israel for influencing the God of Israel to send the snowstorm that delayed visiting U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry meeting with Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Abbas said, "The Jews inserted special prayers last month for God to bring them rain, but used Kabbalistic ideas in a code that encrypted requests that a winter storm would coincide with Kerry's visit and disrupt his schedule. There are too many coincidences here. This is only a hint of what would happen if we were to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. The Jews cannot be trusted. They will use their influence on God to get what they want. There might even be peace, Allah forbid, one day." Abbas also threatened that if Jews do not rip out from their Sabbath prayer books the prayer for the government of Israel to have protection of Israeli soldiers, he will go to the United Nations to declare a boycott on all Jewish synagogues around the world.
Until we do it again, Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.